The cold wind howled through the empty parking lot as Martha Collins stepped out of her faded blue pickup truck. She pulled her coat tighter around her thin shoulders, the fabric worn but clean, the kind that smelled faintly of old lavender and fresh soil. Her boots crunched across the gravel toward the makeshift auction tent, where about 24 people were already gathered. Most were locals, farmers, curious onlookers, and a few younger men in worn ball caps talking too loudly. The auctioneer's voice echoed over the loudspeaker, crackling and sharp. "We've got the last lot coming up. Collins Farm, 80 acres, no working equipment, irrigation systems a mess. Starting bid at 15,000. Anyone?" Martha took a deep breath and looked across the field that stretched beyond the tent, brown, wilted, abandoned, just like everyone said it would always be. It looked hopeless. 15,000. Do I hear 16? People shifted, murmured. No one moved. And then she raised her hand. Whispers snapped through the crowd like dried twigs underfoot. "Is that Martha Collins? She's lost it. She's a widow, ain't she? Been on her own too long. I didn't even know she was still around." The auctioneer hesitated for a split second, then continued. 16,000 from the lady in the brown coat. Do I hear 17? No one answered. Going once, going twice, sold. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed louder than it should have. She didn't flinch. Instead, she gave the man her name, signed the paperwork with a pen that shook ever so slightly in her hand, and walked back to her truck while the others stared like she'd grown wings or gone insane. "What in God's name is she going to do with that place?" someone asked behind her. She heard them, all of them. But she didn't turn around. Driving away, her hands steady on the wheel, she allowed herself a small smile. Not out of victory. There was no victory yet. Just something closer to peace. It wasn't really about the land. It was about the promise. The one she'd made 3 years ago, holding her husband Henry's hand as he lay in that hospital bed, tubes and monitors trying to pretend like they mattered more than love. "If you ever find a reason," he had whispered, breath ragged. "Go back to the earth. It always knew how to heal." The Collins farm wasn't much to look at. Hell, it wasn't much of anything anymore, but it used to be. Back before bankruptcy, back before drought after drought stripped it down to its bones. It had been the lifeblood of the village. It fed families, built futures. And then, just like that, it died. She remembered the stories Henry told her about growing up on that land. How his father used to run his hands through the soil like it was a sacred ritual. "If the dirt is still warm, we're still breathing," he'd say. Now it was hers. Martha pulled over on the side of the road that bordered the property. She stepped out and walked along the fence line, her boots sinking slightly in the mud where yesterday's rain hadn't yet dried. The wind pushed at her back as if urging her forward. Overgrown weeds tangled through the fencing. The barn leaned like it had grown tired of standing. The fields rolled out flat and lifeless, a graveyard for what once was, and yet she stood there. Like it was holy ground. "This is for you, Henry," she said quietly. The air was still silent, listening. Back in town, the gossip had already begun to grow roots. "She's wasting her savings. Someone should talk to her before she hurts herself. Maybe she's just trying to feel useful." But none of them had seen the way Henry looked at the land, and none of them knew what Martha saw when she looked at it now. It wasn't just a farm. It was a story begging to be rewritten. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The morning. After the auction, Martha woke up before the sun, same as always. It was a habit she'd kept from her days running the bakery with Henry, back when the clatter of mixing bowls and the smell of cinnamon rolls had filled their little kitchen with life. Back when there was still laughter echoing off the walls, and someone to share the silence with. Now it was just her and the steady creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She brewed a small pot of coffee, black and strong, and carried it to the table, where a worn, leather-bound notebook lay open. The pages were filled with Henry's handwriting, sketches of farming layouts, notes on soil pH, tips from his father, little affirmations scrawled in the margins like, "Droughts come and go, but good earth remembers." She traced the lines, with her finger pausing at a note he'd written during his final month. "If you're reading this, you still believe in something." Outside the window, the sky was just beginning to blush with light. She sipped the coffee, lukewarm now, and watched the slow rise of dawn over the hills. Her bones ached more in the mornings than they used to, but she didn't complain. Not out loud. After breakfast, she packed up her old canvas tote bag with gloves, pruning shears, a thermos of water, and the same notebook. She grabbed her keys from the wall hook, next to the photo of Henry in his overalls, standing beside a sunflower that came up to his shoulders. "Keep an eye on me today," she murmured to the photo. "Lord knows I'll need it." The drive to the farm took just 10 minutes, but it felt longer, heavier. The roads wound through hills that used to be green and now sat dry and faded. She passed empty storefronts, the shuttered general store, the old gas station with its peeling paint and rusted pumps. The town of Hollow Creek wasn't what it used to be. There were still people living there, folks holding on because it was home or because leaving took money they didn't have. But hope, that had left a long time ago. Martha parked just off the dirt path that led to the main gate of the farm. The hinges screeched when she opened it, like even the land was protesting her return. She stepped into the field, her boots sinking slightly into the morning dew. The barn looked worse up close, sagging in the middle, one door hanging off its hinge and part of the roof torn open like a forgotten wound. Still, she smiled. Not because it wasn't bad, it was, but because there was something peaceful about it too. A stillness that reminded her of sitting next to Henry on summer evenings, drinking sweet tea and watching fireflies blink in the dark. She walked to the center of the field, where the soil was bare and cracked. "Looks like we're both starting." "Over," she whispered. A small bark startled her, followed by the soft pounding of paws against the dirt. She turned to see a familiar, scrappy figure bounding toward her, Blue, the half-blind hound from next door, tail wagging like a flag in a storm. "Well, I'll be," she said, crouching to pet him. "Still remember me, huh?" he responded, with a happy groan and a slobbery lick to her chin. Right behind him was Tommy Granger, the 12-year-old from across the road, panting and red-faced. "Sorry, Miss Martha." He got out again. "I think he smelled your coffee," she smiled. That mutt always did have good taste. Tommy bent down to catch his breath, glancing around at the land. "You really going to try to fix this place up?" Martha nodded, pushing, her grey hair from her face. "That's the plan." He kicked at the dirt. "Everyone says it's a waste. I'm not everyone, Tommy." He looked up at her, then curiosity flickering in his eyes. "You need help?" She raised an eyebrow. "You offering?" He nodded, straightening his baseball cap. "I don't have much to do after school. And Blue likes you." Martha chuckled. "That makes two of you." And just like that, she had a crew. By afternoon, Tommy had helped clear half the front fence of vines and trash. Blue napped in the shade of the truck, while Martha made a list of everything the land needed. Soil samples, water testing, basic tools, maybe even a new generator. But more than anything, time and faith. Later that day, as she packed up to leave, Tommy hesitated near the gate. "Miss Martha." My mom said, she said people are laughing about what you did. About the auction." Martha paused, meeting his eyes. "Well," she said slowly, "let them laugh. Laughter's not so bad. It means they're watching." He didn't understand it fully, not yet, but he nodded anyway. That night, alone again in her house, Martha opened Henry's notebook to the back page. She wrote in her neat, careful hand, "Day 1, I went back to the dirt. It doesn't feel alive yet, but neither did I until today. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of a broken, tired field, something unseen began to stir. 2 days after the auction, Martha stood at the edge of the field with a shovel in her hand and a prayer in her chest. The sun beat down hard for early April, casting long shadows across the farm like time itself was watching. She'd brought her notebook, a jug of water, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and the same beat-up shovel Henry had used back in the day. The handle was splintered and the blade dulled by years of hard ground, but she couldn't imagine using anything else. The silence was thick, no birds, no insects, just wind, and the faint creaking of the old barn swaying like it might fall with the next gust. This wasn't just a fixer-upper, it was a ghost. And most of the town had already written its obituary, But Martha had other plans. She walked the perimeter first, mapping the edges with each footstep, counting off distances in her head. The fencing was almost gone in some places, broken, bent, swallowed by weeds. An entire corner had collapsed completely. She'd need wire, nails, maybe help if anyone was willing. If anyone's willing. In her mind she heard the voices again. You're too old for this. No one farms anymore, Martha. That land hasn't grown anything in 15 years. It's cursed. She paused near the old irrigation shed. The door had caved in, eaten by termites. Or time. She peeked inside anyway. Rotted hoses, a rusted spade, and to her surprise, a faded box of seed packets, most expired, but still sealed. She carried them out like they were relics. Brushed the dust off gently. Sweet corn, zucchini, butternut squash. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. It was something. A beginning. Back in town, they'd already started whispering. At the grocery store. Did you see Martha in the supply aisle again? Poor thing. What's she going to do with 5 bags of topsoil? She should be somewhere warm, Florida maybe, not digging around in that cemetery of a farm. Even Susan, her younger sister, had called twice this week, both times leaving. Voicemails that started with, I'm worried about you, and ended with, please, Martha, don't do this to yourself. But Martha didn't feel worried. She felt more awake than she had in years. Grief, when it first hit, had been a fog, a quiet, cruel kind. She'd sleep all day. Forget to eat. Pretend she didn't hear the phone ring. She let the bakery go. Let the flowers out front die. She let everything fall silent. But this land, it wasn't silent. It hummed under her boots. It remembered things. The Collins farm hadn't always looked like this. Henry used to tell stories about peach trees that bloomed so thick with fruit. The branches had to be tied up with rope. Rows of corn taller than a man, and children playing hide-and-seek between the stalks. But that was long before the droughts, before pesticides wrecked the soil, before the banks foreclosed, and Henry's childhood home passed through so many hands that even the town gave up on it. That afternoon, while Martha worked on clearing a path to the well, she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. She turned and saw Pastor Allen, tall and soft-spoken, his sleeves rolled up and sweat glistening on his brow. I heard you bought this place, he said, looking around. I did, she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. Got it for the price of a used lawnmower, he chuckled. Well, if you need prayers, you're standing on holy ground, at least according to Henry. He used to call this place God's front porch. Martha's eyes softened. He did. Say that, didn't he? I remember he believed in this land, so do I, he nodded. If you need anything, tools, maybe a few helping hands, I could ask around the congregation, she raised a brow. They willing to work with? Crazy old widow who talks to dirt, he smiled. Well, if they aren't, I'll remind them it was a widow who fed Elijah in the drought. Martha let out a real laugh, her first in weeks. Pastor Allen helped her clear debris from the barn doorway, and as the sun dipped low behind the hills, she stood on the porch of the old farmhouse, looking out across the land. It still looked tired, still looked forgotten, but under the dry soil and cracked fences there was something else. Promise. Later that night, back home with Blue snoring at her feet and a cup of chamomile tea in her hand, Martha opened the notebook again. Day 3. They've forgotten what this land used to be, but I haven't, and I think maybe the land hasn't either. She closed the book and whispered into the quiet, Tomorrow we start again. And out there in the darkness the land waited. 3 days into clearing the land, Martha's hands were already blistered, her back a constant dull ache, and her knees creaked every time she bent down. But she didn't complain. Not once. Pain, she had learned, was just another way your body reminded you that you were still alive. That morning the sky was the color of faded denim, heavy with the threat of rain. The breeze carried the scent of turned earth and old wood, mixing with the lingering musk of wild onion grass. Martha stood at the edge of the field, her eyes fixed on the ground she'd spent hours clearing. She had marked out a small plot, just 20 feet by 10. It was all she had the energy for. That, and the courage. She kneeled slowly, her joints protesting. and reached into her canvas bag for one of the old seed packets from the irrigation shed. Sweet corn. The packet was faded and slightly warped from moisture, but the kernels inside still held a warmth in her palm. She could almost hear Henry's voice behind her. "Plant it with faith," he used to say. "Seeds know what to do even if we forget." She pressed one into the dirt, then another, and another. Each one felt like a prayer, but doubt crept in with the breeze. This land hadn't produced a harvest in over a decade. Everyone in Hollow Creek had written it off, not just because of the drought, but because something in the soil had gone wrong. Something no one had figured out. A fungus, maybe, or runoff from that chemical spill years back. No one had tried to fix it. Not seriously. And yet here she was. 65, alone, broke, and sowing corn into the ground like it was 1965. And she was young and full of dreams again. She paused mid-plant, her fingers dirty, her thoughts louder than the wind. What if they're right? What if the land's dead? What if this is just grief pretending to be purpose? She didn't want to cry, but her throat tightened. Just then, a shadow crossed the field. "Hey, Miss Martha." "Tommy." He jogged over, holding a Tupperware container. "Mum, sent leftover chili. Said you probably forgot to eat lunch again." She laughed softly, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I think your mother's psychic." He handed it to her, then looked down at the seeds still waiting to be planted. "You really think anything'll grow here?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "I don't know." He nodded, not with judgment, but with something closer to loyalty. Then, after a pause, he said, "I asked my science teacher about soil testing. She gave me a kit to bring out here. If we could try it." Martha blinked. "You did that?" He shrugged. "I figure, if you're planting, the least I can do is check if the dirt's still got a heartbeat." She smiled, her chest tightening for a different reason now. "That's mighty kind of you, Tommy." They spent the next hour poking little tubes into the dirt, measuring pH and moisture. Tommy wrote down notes like a little scientist, muttering things like, "We'll need compost," and "Your nitrogen levels are sadder than my math grades." By sundown, they'd tested 3 spots and found one that, miraculously, still held. Promise? That night, Martha ate the chili by lamplight, warm and spicy, with crackers and a ginger ale. She flipped through the notebook and wrote, "Day 4. The land is tired, so am I." But Tommy's eyes didn't carry doubt. They carried wonder. "I'm planting into that." The next morning brought rain. Not heavy, not stormy, just a gentle shower, steady and soaking. Martha stood on the porch of the farmhouse, steaming mug in hand, and watched the drops kiss the ground like a blessing. Tiny dark spots appeared where seeds had been sown, and for the first time in years the air smelled like life was coming. But down in town, things weren't quite as hopeful. At May's diner, over pancakes and weak coffee, the talk turned to Martha again. "She's wasting time," said old Earl Griggs, former mayor, current self-appointed town expert. "The farm's poison, always has been." Across from him, Connie Thomas, whose family once farmed before losing everything to the bank, crossed her arms. "Maybe, but she's doing more than most of us. You ever think of that?" "I think she's in over her head." "She's got grit," Connie said. "That used to count for something." Back at the farm, Martha didn't hear any of it. She was kneeling again, planting squash seeds this time. Rain dripping down her back, mud clinging to her boots. Her fingers moved slower, her body stiff, but her spirit was rooted. Later, just as the clouds began to break, Pastor Allen returned with 2 teenagers from his church, twins Marcus and Jaden. Big boys, polite, eager to help. They started, clearing the barn's back room and stacking old lumber. By sunset, the farm didn't look like much, but it felt different. There was movement, there was noise, there was purpose, and just beneath the surface, the first green shoots of something long buried began to push toward the light. Martha didn't notice it at first. She'd been too busy fighting, with a rusted rake behind the barn, trying to clear a path where the roof had caved in. Blue was curled up nearby, tail twitching in his sleep, snoring like an old man. The sun hung low, casting gold across everything, the kind of light that made even the broken things feel beautiful for a moment. Tommy came sprinting across the field, his voice cracking mid-shout. "Miss Martha, it's happening, it's happening!" She stood, brushing dirt off her jeans. "Slow down before you trip over your own feet," What's happening? He didn't slow down. Instead, he pointed toward the test plot, the one she'd planted with sweet corn 5 days earlier. The one she kept checking with fingers crossed and breath held. There, just barely peeking through the surface of the soil, was a thin, fragile sprout. Pale green, barely an inch high. But it was there. Martha's breath caught. She dropped the rake, walked over slowly, heart pounding faster than it should have, and knelt beside the little thing. It wasn't much. A curve of stem, a suggestion of leaves, the kind of thing you could miss if you weren't looking hard enough. But to her, it was a miracle. She reached down, gently brushed the dirt around it, and whispered, "Well, aren't you a stubborn little thing?" Tommy grinned. "Told you, this land's not dead." "No," she said softly, just waiting to be heard. That night, Martha didn't just write in the notebook. She celebrated. Made cornbread from a box mix and split it with Tommy and Blue on the porch of the farmhouse. The sky turned deep purple, and for the first time in a long time, the stars didn't feel so far away. Tommy talked about school, about how his dad left a few years back, how his mum worked 2 jobs and still came home smiling. He said helping on the farm made him feel like he was doing something that mattered. Martha listened, nodding, her heart aching in that soft maternal way that never really leaves you, even after your own kids have grown and moved far away. "You ever think about giving up?" he asked suddenly, looking out at the fields. She took a long sip of sweet tea, then said, "Every day. But then I think about what it means if I do. This farm isn't just about growing corn. It's about not letting everything fall apart." Tommy didn't answer, but he understood. She could see it in the way he sat a little straighter, the way he didn't pull his phone out once the whole evening. But not everyone was rooting for Martha's comeback. Word had spread fast in town that something had started to grow out on the old Collins farm. And with that news came curiosity and doubt. The next morning, a black SUV pulled up to the gate. Martha was setting up her compost bins behind the barn when she saw it. The windows were tinted, the kind of car that didn't belong on dirt roads. Out stepped Stanley Carter, a land developer from Springfield. Slick suit, designer shoes coated in mud already, and a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Martha Collins," he called out, walking toward her with a forced friendliness. "I've been meaning to come see you." She straightened up slowly. "Can't say I've been meaning to see you," he chuckled like it didn't bother him. "Listen, I heard through a few channels that you bought this place. Crazy thing. Really, couldn't believe it when I saw your name on the title. I get that a lot." He glanced around. "Doesn't look like much, but with the right work, and I mean real investment, we could turn this into something. Subdivisions, maybe a golf course. I know people." "I'm sure you do." He stepped closer. "Look, I know you're out here trying to, I don't know, prove something. But I'm offering you a deal, cash. You'll make more selling to me than you ever will growing squash out of bad dirt." Martha stared at him for a long second, then reached down, picked up a clump of soil in her hand, let it sift through her fingers. "This dirt ain't bad," she said quietly. "It's just been ignored." Stanley's smile thinned. "You're really going to let your pride stop progress?" "No," she said. "I'm letting hope start it." And with that, she turned her back on him. He didn't yell, didn't argue. Just walked back to his shiny SUV, muttering something about old fools and wasted chances. But before he pulled away, he rolled down the window and said, "You won't make it through the season." Martha didn't respond. She just watched him leave, and then, without missing a beat, went back to tending the compost, the kind of quiet defiance that built generations. That evening, she opened the notebook once again. Day 6. First sprout today. Stanley Carter showed up offering money. I told him no. I remembered what Henry said. The land don't need saving, just someone to believe in it. The wind rustled the pages like applause. Out in the field, the tiny green shoot stood taller than it had that morning. And Martha, tired and aching, felt more alive than she had in years. The wind changed on a Tuesday. It was the kind of shift you couldn't see, but you could feel it, deep in your joints, in the way the trees leaned differently, in how the birds got quiet all at once. Martha knew storms. She'd grown up with the kind that swept in from the west like they owned the place, flinging branches and rattling windows, and shaking loose anything not nailed down. This one had that same feeling. She stood on the farmhouse porch, arms crossed, staring at the sky as thick grey clouds gathered like an army over the hills. Blue paced restlessly at her feet, his tail low, ears twitching at every rumble. The corn sprouts, there were 4 now, stood vulnerable in the small plot. Tiny, brave little stalks pushing up through hard dirt like they didn't know they were supposed to fail. Tommy had stayed late the day before to help her build a crude barrier from scrap wood and fencing wire. It wasn't much, but it was something. They'd even set up a tarp over part of the plot in case of heavy rain. It flapped now like a warning flag in the wind. The first raindrops hit just before sundown, fat and cold, the kind that carry more threat than comfort. She stayed out until dark, double-checking ropes and weighing down corners of the tarp with bricks. Her clothes were soaked through, and her fingers had gone numb, but she didn't stop. Not even when the thunder cracked so. Loud it shook the porch steps. By midnight, the storm was in full swing. Lightning lit up the fields in strobe-like flashes, revealing swaying stalks and trees bending like dancers in a frantic, terrifying waltz. The wind howled. The tarp snapped violently, one corner breaking loose and flying into the air before being swallowed by the night. Martha stood at the window, helpless. The rain came sideways. The barn creaked, the walls groaned, and her heart pounded harder than it had in months. She should have been afraid, maybe she was, but more than that, she was angry. Angry at the storm, at time, at the way life kept asking her to stand back, up after everything, at how even when she dared to hope, the world tried to crush it. Then something snapped, not in the sky, in her. She threw on her coat, grabbed the old shovel from the mudroom, and headed outside into the storm. Blue barked after her, but she shouted back, "Stay!" Rain stung her face as she ran down to the plot, mud sucking at her boots. Water poured into the trenches, threatening to wash away the fragile seedlings. The tarp was gone. The fence was leaning. One of the sprouts had bent sideways, almost, pulled out of the ground completely. Martha dropped to her knees in the mud and shoved the shovel into the earth, carving a deeper channel for the water to escape. Her hands trembled from the cold. Her back screamed in protest, but she kept digging, forming makeshift irrigation trenches to divert the flood away from her crop. Every time she paused, lightning cracked overhead like a warning. But she didn't care. She was 65, widowed, tired, and absolutely unwilling to let this land go without a fight. By the time she was done, she was soaked, filthy, and shaking from the cold. But the sprouts, 3 of them, still stood. One had snapped, but the others, still there, still reaching. Back in the house, she peeled off her wet clothes and wrapped herself in a wool blanket in front of the fire. Blue curled up beside her, whimpering softly as if he understood exactly what had just happened. She held Henry's notebook in her lap, water dripping from her hair onto the worn pages, and with a shaky hand she wrote, "Day 7. Storm hit. Took one of the sprouts. Tried to take the rest, but they held on. I did too. Sometimes faith is just a shovel and a whole lot of mud." The next morning the town buzzed with gossip. "Did you hear she went out in the middle of it? They say she was digging trenches during the lightning. She could have been killed." But they said it with something new in their voices. Not pity, not mockery, respect, the hesitant kind. The kind that could grow if given the right conditions. That afternoon, Pastor Allen showed up with a truckload of mulch and a knowing smile. "Storm left a mess," he said, "but messes are where most blessings start." And by sunset, 2 more teens from the church arrived to help spread the mulch. Martha stood on the porch, sore but proud, watching the small team of helpers working the land that everyone said was finished. The land that just survived its first real test. And out in the middle of the plot, the 3 remaining corn sprouts stretched a little taller toward the setting sun. In a town like Hollow Creek, secrets don't last, and silence never stays quiet. By Tintu Kamifin. The end of the week. Everyone from the gas station clerk to the mailman knew about Martha Collins digging trenches during a lightning storm. Some called her crazy, others called her courageous. But everyone was talking. May's diner buzzed with it over morning coffee and biscuits. You hear she's got teenagers out there helping her now. Says she's trying to grow corn of all things. She'll break her back before that. Land gives her anything but weeds. I don't know, said Connie from the bakery. My nephew says he saw green sprouts with his own eyes, says she's out there every day before sunrise. That last comment changed the tone of the room. It's one thing to mock a dream. It's another to see it taking root. Martha didn't pay the talk much mind, not because she didn't hear it, but because she had too much to do. Every morning she woke with the sun, hands already stiff and sore before she left bed. She made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, tied her grey hair back with an old bandana and stepped into boots still caked with dried mud from the storm. The routine was saving her, giving her shape, purpose. Blue, always at her heels, had become the unofficial foreman of the farm, barking when someone new arrived, curling up under the tool bench when they stayed. The teens, Marcus, Jaden, and now a quiet girl named Riley, came by on weekends. Pastor Allen brought fresh tools from the church's storage shed. Even Tommy's mom started dropping off food, casseroles mostly, wrapped in foil with notes that said things like, "Just in case you forget to eat again." The farm was still in rough shape, no doubt about it, but the plot had expanded. 7. Cornstalks now, 5 squash. The tomato seedlings were still touch and go, but Martha kept whispering to them anyway. Still, for every small win, the whispers in town grew a little louder. Some folks said she was a hoarder, others swore she'd lost her mind since Henry died, and a few whispered something darker, that maybe she'd brought something unnatural back to the land. One morning she found a note slipped under her gate. Some land should stay buried. No signature. She stared at it for a long time, then fed it to the fire without a second thought. But the next day an unexpected knock came at the farmhouse door. She opened it slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans. Blue stayed pressed against, her side alert. Standing on the porch was a woman maybe 10 years younger than her, dressed too nicely for a farm road. Tailored slacks, smart coat, city shoes that were already gathering dust from the drive. "Mrs. Collins?" the woman asked, offering a hesitant smile. "That's me. I'm Natalie Price. I'm a journalist with the Midland Gazette. I was wondering if you had a moment to talk." Martha raised a brow. "You come all the way from Midland for a story?" I heard whispers. "About a widow who bought a failing farm and might be bringing it back to life. Figured that kind of story. Doesn't come around too often." Martha leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You here to write about the crazy lady with a shovel?" Natalie laughed softly. "I'm here to write about the woman the town can't stop talking about." That gave Martha pause. She studied the woman. Her eyes were sharp, but not cruel. Curious, honest in a way reporters rarely were. "Fine," Martha said. "You've got 20 minutes. But I'm not stopping the chores, so bring shoes you don't mind ruining." They walked the plot together, Martha talking slowly as she weeded the rows. She told Natalie about Henry, how he'd grown up on this land, how they'd dreamed of buying it back one day, and how she'd done it alone after losing him. She explained the soil testing, the teenagers who volunteered, the storm, the trench, the stubborn sprouts, and Natalie took it all in, no judgment. Just that little notebook of hers, scribbling silently. "You ever get tired of proving people wrong?" she asked at one point. Martha chuckled. "Every single day, but it's better than doing nothing." When they returned to the house, Natalie paused at the edge of the porch, glancing back at the field. "It's funny," she said. "Most people would have walked away from a place like this, said it was too far gone." Martha nodded. Most people didn't marry a man who believed land remembers love. Natalie scribbled that one down. "I'll send you a draft," she said. "Should be in Sunday's paper." And just like that, she was gone. But something had shifted, not in the soil this time, in the air. Because 2 days later, the story hit. The front page of the Midland Gazette under the headline, "Widow reclaims dying farm and the town might just need her more than they know." It was picked up online, shared, talked about. And Hollow Creek? Hollow Creek started paying a little more attention, not just to the farm, but to Martha. It started with the mailbox. 3 days after the article went live, Martha found a thick envelope wedged inside, bearing no return address. The paper inside smelled like cologne and money. A real estate flyer, a typed letter. "Mrs. Collins, I represent a group of investors interested in acquiring your property. Your recent media attention has added value to the land. We are prepared to make a generous offer. Call the number below at your earliest convenience." Martha didn't even finish reading. She tore the paper once, then again, then a third time, and fed the pieces to the compost bin. Blue watched from the porch, his ears twitching, as if he sensed something wasn't sitting right. Later that afternoon, she spotted a black truck parked just beyond the tree line on the edge of the property. It wasn't the SUV from Stanley Carter. This one was older, local, the kind that came with boots on the dash and a rifle in the back window. It stayed for 20 minutes before driving off. On Saturday, folks started showing up. Not reporters, not teenagers, people from Hollow Creek, at Io. First, just one or two, then a few more. A woman named Belinda asked if she could trade 3 jars of homemade jam for a basket of vegetables when the crops came in. A retired schoolteacher offered her old rain barrels, and Connie from the bakery showed up with a dozen cinnamon rolls and 2 strong arms, asking if Martha needed help reinforcing the chicken coop they were building from salvaged wood. Martha didn't know what to say, so she just said, "You got a hammer?" Connie grinned. "Sure do." But Sunday brought a different kind of visit. Martha was inside kneading bread dough, her first real attempt in years, when Blue barked loud and sharp. A low growl followed, not the excited bark he gave Tommy, or the playful one when he chased butterflies. This one meant business. She wiped her hands on a towel, walked to the door, and opened it slowly. Standing just beyond the gate was a man in his early 40s, lean, well-dressed in a way that screamed city lawyer, and beside him, Martha's breath. Caught, it was Lena, her daughter. For a moment time folded. All the years between them collapsed into the sight of her child standing there, arms crossed, chin lifted in that way she used to do when she was 15 and mad about curfew. Martha stepped onto the porch. "Lena." "Mom." The man beside her stepped forward. "Mrs. Collins, I'm Mark Elliott. I represent your daughter in legal and estate matters." Martha's stomach tightened. "Is this about the farm?" Lena sighed, brushing wind-blown hair behind her ear. "I just want to talk. Can we come in?" Martha hesitated. The wind moved through the trees like it was listening. "Only her," she said finally. Mark looked like he was about to protest, but Lena put a hand on his arm. "It's fine." He stepped back and Lena entered the gate, walking slowly, like she wasn't sure the ground wouldn't give way under her. They sat on the porch in silence for a while. Blue stayed at Martha's feet, his eyes never leaving Lena. Finally, Lena said, "I saw the article. I didn't even know you bought the place." "You haven't called in 2 years, Martha said, not unkindly. "Just the truth. I didn't think you'd want to hear from me." "I always want to hear from you." That landed like a stone between them. "I'm worried about you, Mom," Lena said. "You're 65, living alone on a broken-down farm with no electricity in half the house. I don't understand why." Martha looked out at the fields. "Because this place still matters." "To who?" "To me. To your father. He's gone." "I know," Martha said, her voice steady. "But he believed this land had one more story left in it. And now I do too." Lena's eyes filled just a little. "It's not practical. It's not supposed to be. It's personal." They sat with that. "I want to help," Lena finally said. "We could sell it, together. Get you somewhere safe, something easier. You could come live near me, see." The kids more. Martha shook her head. "Honey, I'm not chasing ease, I'm chasing purpose, and I've got it here." Lena bit her lip. "Even if it breaks you?" "Especially then," Martha said. "That's how you know it's worth it." They didn't hug, not yet. The space between them was still too full of old words, old wounds. But Lena stood and said, "I'll call more." "I'd like that." She left without looking back, and the lawyer followed, eyeing the land like it was still a chessboard. But something in Lena's shoulders had softened, and that was enough for now. That night Martha wrote day 12, "Lena came, wants me to sell, says I could have something easier, but I don't want easier. I want something that grows back after this storm, like me." Outside, a new row of tomato seedlings had started to sprout. The first real harvest came in the dead of night. It wasn't the grand unveiling Martha had envisioned, no fanfare, no cheering crowd, but it was enough. enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't crazy after all. It had been a rough month. The mornings grew colder and the farm, still mostly barren, hadn't yielded anything substantial. Martha woke early each day to check on her crops, patting the soil, listening for that faint murmur of life that hadn't quite given up. And then it happened. The corn stalks, those 7 stubborn shoots that had been nothing but green promises, for weeks, finally produced their first cobs. A handful of tomatoes, too, showing red against the green, like little jewels against a dying sun. But it was the squash, of all things, that nearly made Martha cry. The vines had wrapped themselves tightly around the makeshift trellis she'd built out of scrap wood, heavy with the fruit of her labor. By midnight, she couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, and the house felt more like a cave than a home. But there was a quiet rhythm in the air that kept her awake. She grabbed her worn gloves, grabbed a flashlight and shuffled out the door into the damp chill. Blue trotted beside her, his tail wagging despite the late hour. Martha kneeled in the dirt, hands trembling as she picked the squash first, one, then another, then 3 more, each bright and plump. She moved to the tomatoes next, carefully gathering the fruit in her apron until it was full, and then she stopped in front of the corn, looking at the pale husks as if they were gold. When she peeled back the first husk, revealing kernels pale as the moon, Martha let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked up at the starry sky, a single tear tracing the lines of her weathered face. "Henry," she whispered. "We did it." She hadn't told anyone she was picking yet, not the teens, not Connie, not even Tommy, who had become more of a regular presence, bringing his homemade tools and spending hours tinkering around the property. But it didn't matter. The harvest was hers, and it was the first time in years that Martha felt like she was truly on solid ground. By morning, the farm was different. The rows of crops seemed fuller, richer. The sky above was lighter, as though the sun had decided to finally shine on this place again. Tommy came by first, his old truck bumping down the dirt road. He parked beside the barn, whistling low when he saw the sacks of squash and tomatoes stacked neatly by the porch. "You're up early," he called, pushing his sleeves up. Martha wiped her hands on her jeans and smiled. "Had to pick some things." He moved toward the sacks, kneeling to feel the ripeness of the tomatoes. His eyes widened. "You really did it?" "I guess I did," Martha said, stepping closer. Tommy looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then finally he laughed. "You've been saying it was possible, but you sure made me a believer." They worked together for the rest of the morning. Tommy carried the harvest to the small barn, helping Martha pack them into crates for delivery. By noon, the whole town knew. It started with one phone call to May's diner. Then it spread through the gossip mill faster than the smell of fresh bread. The town's chatter turned from mockery to amazement, and soon enough a small crowd had gathered near Martha's gate. Connie, always the first to show up, was the first to volunteer to help pack and distribute the produce. "We'll get this to everyone," she said, clapping Martha on the shoulder. "You've earned this." "Not just me," Martha replied. "We've earned this." The teens, too, came to help. Marcus, Jaden, and Riley, each with a grin on their face that was as wide as the fields themselves. They carried baskets of squash to the cars parked along the dirt road, offering them to anyone who passed by. There was something humbling about seeing the town's reaction. The same people who had whispered, who had doubted her sanity, were now standing at her gate, shaking their heads in disbelief and gratitude. Even Lena, who had been silent for days after their last conversation, called, her voice cracking with something close to pride. "You really did it, Mom. I didn't think it was possible, but—" "I told you the land had one more story left," Martha replied, "and I wasn't going to let it go." By the end of the day, the harvest wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. People began lining up to see the farm, to ask questions, to offer their help. A few of the local farmers even showed up to inspect the crops, their skepticism now turning into admiration. Lena called again, this time with news that had Martha's heart skipping a beat. "There's an article, a bigger one. They want to do a whole feature on you." Martha was silent for a moment. "A feature?" "Yeah. They're saying that the way you've brought this place back from the brink of disaster is something special, and they think it could be a blueprint for other struggling farms in the area. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she looked at the harvested crops stacked neatly in the barn. I never thought I'd be a blueprint for anything. Well, now you are, Lena said softly, and I think that's something worth believing in. Martha smiled, looking out over the land she had fought to restore. Maybe it's time we all started believing. The harvest was far from over. There was more to do, more work to be done in the soil, and more hands to help. But for the first time in years, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Martha stood at the edge of the farm, blue by her side. The land stretched out before her, ready to yield more, to give more. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the evening, Martha realized that this wasn't just about the crops. This wasn't about the farm at all. It was about rebuilding something much deeper, and it was just the beginning. The offer came in the morning mail, wrapped in a crisp, professional envelope that looked too formal to be good news. Martha opened it slowly, staring at the elegant typeface on the front. Golden Acres Real Estate Development. Inside, the letter outlined the terms of a buyout, an offer that made Martha's hands shake when she read the numbers. It wasn't just an offer, it was an ultimatum. Mrs. Collins, based on recent developments and your land's growing profile, we are prepared to offer you a sum that exceeds current market value by a significant margin. This opportunity will provide you the means to retire comfortably and move forward without the burden of the farm's upkeep. The letter continued with the usual jargon about the future of Hollow Creek, community progress, and a focus on revitalizing the area. And then it got personal. We understand your strong attachment to the land and your late husband's legacy. However, it's essential to acknowledge the changing dynamics of rural farming. Our offer is fair and forward-looking. We urge you to reconsider the risk of clinging to an uncertain future. Martha set the letter down on the kitchen table. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, threatening to crush the dream she'd spent the last few months rebuilding. For days, Martha kept the letter hidden, tucked away in her drawer. But it wouldn't leave her mind. Each time she passed by the barn, she saw the stacks of crates filled with squash and tomatoes, the fruits of her labor, and it felt like a victory. But beneath that, she could feel the tension building, the pressure to let go, to sell the farm, to walk away and accept the life she never thought she'd need. Connie came by on the fourth day, after the letter arrived, bringing fresh bread and a gallon of homemade apple cider. She noticed the envelope tucked in Martha's drawer, and though she didn't say anything at first, the knowing look in her eyes said it all. "Is it that bad?" Connie asked, sitting down at the kitchen table. Martha nodded. "They're offering a lot. Too much, maybe." Connie's brow furrowed. "But you don't want to sell, do you?" Martha looked out the window, where Blue was running through the yard chasing the last of the evening light. "I don't know anymore." There was a pause before Connie spoke again, quieter this time. "You've built something here, Martha. You've built more than just a farm. You've built something for this whole town. It might be harder than anything you've ever done, but I think that's why it matters so much." Martha felt the words settle deep in her bones. It wasn't about selling or keeping. It was about what the farm had become, what it had taught her, what it had brought back to her life. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for meaning. The next day, Tommy arrived early, pulling his truck up to the gate. Martha had been staring out the window again, her mind working over the same ground. He knocked on the door, then stepped inside when she motioned him in. "You look like you haven't slept in days," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Can't sleep, can't think," she replied. "I've got an offer. A good one. 2. Good, maybe. They want to buy me out." Tommy's face hardened. "They don't understand. They're just looking at the numbers." "Maybe they're right," she said quietly. "Maybe it's too much. I'm too old to keep up with all this, and the work, it's never ending." "Yeah, it is," Tommy said with a chuckle. "But you know what? It's your work. It's not just about the tomatoes or the squash. It's about everything this place stands for." Martha shook her head. "But it's not about me anymore, Tommy. It's about the farm, and I don't know if I can make it grow enough to survive, let alone keep it running. Tommy sat beside her. It's not about growing the farm, Martha. It's about letting it grow with you. Her eyes met his, and for the first time she saw something more than just the mechanic who helped her fix the fence, or the guy who delivered firewood. Tommy had a quiet understanding of what the land meant, of what she needed from it. You've got the town behind you, Martha. That's something money can't buy. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folding in her lap. But it's not enough, is it? What if I'm just holding on to something that isn't meant to last? Tommy didn't respond right away. He stood up and walked to the window, his back turned to her. Then he said softly, "Maybe it's not meant to last forever, but that doesn't mean you stop fighting for it." Martha sat there for a long time, the weight of the decision pressing on her. The letter from Golden Acres was still in her drawer. The temptation was real. The pressure to let go was like a wave just waiting to pull her under. But Tommy was right. She had something the developers couldn't touch. She had the people who believed in her, who believed in the farm, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. That evening, after Tommy left, Martha made a decision. She walked to the edge of the property, standing at the corner where the cornstalk swayed in the evening breeze. She looked over the fields, the patches of squash and tomatoes, the newly sprouted rows of beans, and the barn that stood strong against the horizon. She pulled the letter from Golden Acres from her pocket and read it one last time, her eyes tracing each word, each number. Then, with a steady hand, she folded it up and tucked it away in her coat pocket. She wasn't ready to sell. Not yet. She still had work to do. That night, when the stars were bright and the wind was still, Martha sat at the kitchen table and wrote. Day. Faze, they want me to give up the farm, but I can't, not yet. Not until I know I've done everything I can to make it grow, to make it mean something. Outside, the wind had stopped. The moonlight washed over the fields, and for the first time in a long time, Martha felt at peace. She had a long road ahead of her, but she wasn't walking it alone anymore. The first frost of the season had come, early, covering the farm in a thin blanket of ice by dawn. It wasn't a heavy frost, but it was enough to remind Martha of the looming challenges ahead. As she stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in her worn woolen shawl, the air bit at her cheeks and the sky hung heavy with clouds, promising more than just cold. The harvest was coming to an end, and with it, the pressure to make sure the farm had enough to carry them through the winter. Tommy had been right. It wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about the whole town. And Martha felt the weight of that responsibility on her shoulders, more with each passing day. She'd made her decision, but it wasn't without consequences. The farmers in town had taken notice of the growing success of her little farm. Some had started to visit regularly, offering help, advice, and sometimes just their presence. The support was heartwarming, but it also brought new expectations. She couldn't let them down. The frost had made the morning chores more difficult. The barn door creaked as she pushed it open, the icy hinges protesting. Inside, the animals were quieter than usual, huddling together for warmth. She moved between them, filling the troughs, checking on the chickens and cows. Every motion felt deliberate, every task measured. It wasn't just the usual routine. Today, it was different. Today, every step felt like part of a larger plan, a plan she wasn't entirely sure of herself. By mid-morning, a truck pulled up to the gate. Martha squinted against the weak sun as she wiped her hands on her apron. Connie's familiar face appeared in the passenger seat, and the driver, a broad-shouldered man Martha didn't immediately recognize, waved as he climbed out of the truck. "Morning, Martha," Connie called, grinning from ear to ear. "Got a little surprise for you." Martha raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" The man with Connie nodded toward the truck bed, where several large boxes were stacked, the tops covered with old tarps. "You're not the only one with a good crop this year," he said, lifting the tarp to reveal several crates filled with more squash, tomatoes, and bundles of beans. "We all pitched in a bit," Connie explained, her voice soft but excited. "We thought we'd bring a little more to your farm. You know, a bit of a gift for the work you've been doing, a good harvest and all." Martha felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked over the crops that the farmers had brought. They weren't just giving her vegetables, they were giving her the fruits of their labor, a symbol of their belief in what she was doing, and in her. For the first time in a long while, Martha felt tears prickle at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." Connie smiled. "You don't have to say anything. We know what this farm means to you. We know you've been through a lot to get it to where it is, and we know it's going to keep growing. It's not just the crops that are growing, it's the whole town." Martha nodded, unable to speak. Instead, she stepped forward, opening the truck bed wide. "Let's get these inside. We've got work to do." The group of farmers unloaded the crates, bringing them into the barn, where Martha had set up a rudimentary storage system for her harvest. She felt a new sense of purpose as she worked alongside them, a quiet satisfaction settling in her chest. These people weren't just helping her, they were investing in the future of Hollow Creek. But the generosity of her neighbors wasn't without its complications. Later that afternoon, a figure appeared at the end of the driveway, kicking up the dirt as he approached. It was Matt Harrington, the real estate developer who had sent Martha the buyout letter. "Afternoon, Mrs. Collins," Matt said, tipping his hat with a forced smile. "I see you've got company today." Martha didn't smile back. "What can I do for you, Mr. Harrington?" He leaned against the fence, his eyes scanning the barn and the fields behind it. "I was just in the area and thought I'd stop by. I wanted to make sure you received our offer." Martha crossed her arms. "I did, and I've decided to hold off, for now." Matt's smile faltered. "That's unfortunate. We've made a very generous offer. The land's worth a lot more than you realize, Martha. It would set you up for life." She stood tall, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm not interested." "You don't know what you're turning down. That's the problem with people who cling to outdated ways of life. They don't see the bigger picture." Martha took a step forward, her voice steady and strong. "And you don't understand the people of this town. We're not just about the land or the money. We're about something more than that." Matt's expression hardened. "I see. Well, I'm sure you'll come around. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." He turned to leave, but Martha watched him go, feeling a sense of defiance rise within her. She wasn't just fighting for her farm anymore. She was fighting for something much larger, the soul of Hollow Creek. The days that followed were long. Martha threw herself into the work even more, organizing storage, preserving what she could, and continuing to manage the farm with the help of the other townsfolk. They all came together in ways she hadn't imagined, each one contributing something, to keep the town fed for the coming winter. But with the growing support came a new set of challenges. The pressure to provide for everyone, her neighbors, the town, and herself, was mounting. She couldn't afford to let anyone down, but at times it felt like the weight was too much to bear. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of warm cider, she reflected on the path ahead. She'd made it, this far, but the road was still long and there were so many unknowns. Could she really make it through another winter with the farm? She thought about the letter tucked away in her drawer, the one from Golden Acres, and the people who had offered her so much money for a piece of land that had meant so much more than just dirt and crops. Maybe she couldn't change everything. But one thing was clear: the long road ahead wouldn't be walked alone. As the frost settled deeper over the land and winter approached, Martha knew that the farm's survival didn't rest on her alone. It rested on everyone who believed in her, and she was ready to fight, for herself, for them, and for Hollow Creek. The wind had started to pick up by mid-afternoon. What had begun as a mild breeze had turned into something more ominous. The trees were bending under the force, their branches swaying like broken limbs. In the distance, the sky had darkened, the clouds thick and swirling like a giant fist tightening. Around the horizon, Martha stood on the porch, her hand resting on the railing as she gazed at the sky, her breath visible in the cool, crisp air. The early signs of a storm were clear. She'd seen enough winters on the farm to know when something big was coming. She looked toward the barn, where the animals were becoming restless. It was time to bring them in, but it wasn't just the storm she was worried about. A sense of unease had been creeping over her for the past few days, and now it felt like everything she had worked for might come crashing down with this storm. The first few raindrops fell just as the sky let loose, followed quickly by a sudden gust of wind that nearly took Martha's hat off. She hurried inside to find Tommy, his face drawn with concern. "It's going to be a big one," he said, shaking his head as he peered out the window. "You should have seen the look on old George's face. Said it might be worse than anything we've seen in years." "Worse than the blizzard last year?" Martha asked, her voice tight. Tommy didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed a few tools off the wall and began to prepare for the storm. "Worse, maybe. But the thing is, it's not just the wind and snow we've got to worry about. The two crops? If they aren't harvested before this gets too bad, we'll lose everything." Martha's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" "We've got hours, maybe less, before it's too late. If we don't move fast, the tomatoes, squash, beans, everything will rot or freeze before we can save it." Martha knew he was right. The crops had been doing well, but they weren't immune to the brutal forces of nature. She quickly put a plan in motion, sending Tommy to round up the others in the village. There wasn't time to waste. As the storm raged outside, Martha and her neighbors worked together in a blur of motion. The barn became a frenzy of activity as they harvested everything they could, the weight of the work taking its toll. The rain had turned into sheets, pouring down in torrents, soaking them to the bone as they moved from the fields to the barn. The wind howled, making it nearly impossible to hear each other, but they pressed on, knowing that every minute counted. Martha's hands were raw, her arms sore from lifting bushels of crops, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The weight of her responsibility hung heavy on her, and she had no intention of failing now. By the time the sun had set and the storm had reached its peak, they had managed to save most of the crops. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to give them a fighting chance. The barn was packed to the brim with what they had managed to pull from the fields. Martha looked around at the faces of her neighbors, their expressions weary but determined. The storm was far from over, but they had done something incredible today. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We couldn't have done it without you." Connie, standing beside her, gave her a tired smile. "No need to thank us. You're the one who brought us all together. This is your farm, Martha. We're just here to help." The storm outside raged on through the night, but inside the barn, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment. They had done it. For now they were safe. As the storm continued its fury, Martha couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. What if the storm wasn't the only thing she had to face? What if the real danger was still waiting on the horizon? She knew Matt Harrington wouldn't give up that easily. He'd been watching from the sidelines, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to make his move. And then there was the reality of keeping the farm running through the winter. They had enough to get by for now, but that wouldn't last long. The days were getting colder, and soon food would be harder to come by. Martha sat down on a hay bale, wrapping her arms around her knees as she thought about the months ahead. She had just begun to feel like she was making progress, and now the storm had come to test her again. But she wasn't going to let the storm, or anything else, break her. She had survived too much to give up now. The following morning, the Wayam storm had passed. The sky was clear, though the air was still biting with the remnants of the wind. The damage had been significant. Some of the fences had come down, and a few trees had fallen, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. The real problem was what the storm had done to the town. As Martha walked through the streets, she saw more signs of destruction. Roofs were damaged, and power lines had been knocked down in several places. The roads were impassable in some areas, leaving people isolated in their homes. Martha knew that things weren't going to be easy. The storm had made it clear that the farm wasn't the only thing they needed to worry about. But as she passed by the other homes in the village, she was reminded of something important. They were all in this together. It wasn't just about the farm, it was about the whole town, standing side by side, helping each other when it mattered most. And Martha wasn't going to stop now. The storm had come, but it was just another obstacle. She had faced worse, and she knew that no matter how hard things got, she would keep fighting for the farm, for the town, for Hollow Creek. The days following the storm were colder than usual. Martha woke up to a blanket of frost covering the fields, a stark reminder of the harsh winter that lay ahead. The crops they had saved were still fresh, but they couldn't last forever. The early harvest had provided a much-needed boost, but it wasn't enough to guarantee survival. Not for the long haul. As Martha worked alongside Tommy to repair the damage to the barn, her mind kept drifting back to one overwhelming thought. How much longer could they keep this up? The cold was setting in, and the work was growing more demanding. With each passing day, it became more clear that survival would come at a high cost. She had never been one to shy away from hard work, but there was a difference between hard work and desperation, and right now, she was teetering on the edge of the latter. The village was facing a crisis. The storm had destroyed a significant portion of the town's infrastructure. Roads were blocked, power was out in many homes, and the local grocery store had been hit hard. With winter settling in, food would become scarce for many families in Hollow Creek. Martha stood at the edge of her property, looking out over the farm. There was so much potential here, so much hope, but the strain of keeping it running was starting to show. The barn needed more repairs, the fences had to be rebuilt, and the greenhouses, which had been her lifeline in recent months, weren't enough to keep the farm profitable on their own. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Martha," said Connie, stepping up beside her. "We need to talk." Martha turned to face her friend, taking in the worry etched on Connie's face. "What's wrong?" "It's the village," Connie said, her voice low. "People are struggling, we're all struggling, and well, I think it's time we consider making a choice." Martha raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Everything we've been doing, working together, saving the crops, holding the farm together. It's been great, but it's not enough. We need a long-term solution, and I think it's time we make a decision about the future." Martha felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "What kind of decision?" Connie hesitated, then spoke carefully. "We need help. More help than we can provide by ourselves. And I think that means selling part of the farm. Maybe even giving up control of it if it comes down to it. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's the reality we face. The farm could provide enough resources to keep the village going, but we need the capital to keep it running. We need equipment, manpower." Martha felt a jolt of shock. Sell part of the farm? She'd worked so hard to build this life, to keep the farm in the family, to keep it going against all odds. The idea of selling it now was unthinkable. But as Connie spoke, Martha's mind was racing. The winter was only going to get worse. The crops could freeze, and if that happened, there was no saving the village. The decision she faced was no longer about pride or sentiment. It was about survival. She swallowed hard. Who would we sell it to? Connie's expression softened. It might be the only way to keep everything from falling apart. You know, there are buyers out there, people who see potential in what we have. If we sold off part of the land, we could have the funds to repair the village, feed everyone, and keep the farm going. It's not ideal, but sometimes the price of survival is steep. The thought of losing the farm or even part of it felt like a punch in the gut. Martha had invested so much of her heart and soul into this place. It was where her husband had worked, where her children had grown up. It was her legacy, but if she didn't act, if she didn't make the hard choice now, everything she had fought for could be lost. That evening, Martha sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the old family photographs on the walls. The faces of her late husband, her children who had long since moved away, and her own younger self, all staring back at her, frozen in time. She reached for the mug of tea in front of her and took a long sip, feeling the warmth spread through her. But the warmth didn't reach her heart. It felt cold. The decision that lay ahead was so much more complicated than she had ever imagined. Could she really let go of what she had worked so hard to protect? Could she sacrifice her legacy for the good of the village? And yet the people of Hollow Creek depended on her. They had rallied together to save the farm, to protect their homes, and now she had to make a choice that would affect their futures. As she pondered, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Tommy standing on the other side, his face grim. "Martha, we've got a problem," he said. "The storms aren't over, there's more bad weather on the way, and we need to act fast. If we don't get the crops out of the ground now, we'll lose everything." Martha's heart sank. More bad weather, more challenges. Her mind raced as she stared at Tommy, torn between the immediate crisis and the long-term choices she would soon have to make. "I know," she said, her voice quiet. "I know, we're going to keep fighting. We've made it this far, we can make it through this. Tommy nodded, though the doubt was evident in his eyes. But Martha, if we don't make a choice soon, it could be too late. And I'm afraid we might lose more than just the farm. Martha took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had always known survival came at a cost, but now she had to decide just how much she was willing to sacrifice. The next day, Martha stood at the edge of her fields once more, gazing out over the land that had been her life for so long. The crops were nearly ready for harvest, but the storm clouds were already gathering on the horizon. She could feel the heavy weight of her decision pressing in on her, the price of survival more apparent than ever. As much as she hated it, the reality was clear. If she didn't act fast, the farm could be gone, and the village with it. Martha had always believed that hope could carry them through the hardest times. But today, she wasn't sure hope would be enough. The wind howled through the cracks in the barn as Martha stood in the doorway, watching the storm clouds gather in the distance. The weather was turning again, and the cold was settling deeper into the land like a slow, creeping poison. The crops they had worked so hard to save were now at the mercy of the elements. Tommy came up behind her, his boots crunching in the frost. "It's not looking good, Martha," he said, his voice low. "We're running out of time." Martha didn't answer immediately. She could feel the weight of the decision she had to make pressing against her chest, suffocating her with its urgency. The thought of selling the land, parting with what had been her family's legacy, felt like a betrayal. But Connie was right. They needed resources, more than they could generate on their own. And if the weather continued to worsen, survival would depend on more than just a few crops. "We can't afford to wait much longer," Tommy continued. "The village, hell. Everyone depends on what we have here, but we need to take action now." Martha's mind raced. Every part of her wanted to refuse, to dig in her heels and fight to the end. She had spent her entire life holding on to this farm, fighting through tragedy, loss, and hardship. Her husband's sudden passing had stolen the man she loved, but it had never stolen her determination to make this place thrive. But now, the game had changed. "Tommy," Martha said, her voice quivering slightly, "I've been thinking about what Connie said. I'm not sure I can do it. I'm not sure I can sell the land." He looked at her, his eyes soft but filled with understanding. "I know it's a hard choice, but look around, Martha. If we don't act now, we might lose it all anyway. Not just the farm, but the village too. We don't have the luxury of time anymore." Martha turned her gaze back to the fields. The crops they had saved were growing taller, still green despite the frost, but the chill in the air told her that it wouldn't last long. The storm was coming, and they had to be ready. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, the weight of the decision pulling her deeper into uncertainty. She had always known survival came with a cost, but she hadn't expected it to feel like this, like a death sentence, even if it was for the greater good. Tommy stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Maybe the gamble is just what we need. You know this farm better than anyone. If you sell off part of it, you could secure the funds we need to fix things. But we can't wait. This storm won't just affect the crops. It'll affect everything." Martha sighed deeply, her breath visible in the freezing air. The storm was coming, but so was her decision. She didn't know if she could live with it, but she did know one thing. If she didn't make a choice now, she might lose everything she had worked so hard to build. "I'll do it," she said quietly, her resolve settling in her chest. "I'll sell part of the farm. It's the only chance we have left." Tommy's face lit up with a rare smile, his eyes full of gratitude. "You've made the right choice, Martha. We'll make it through this. Together." Martha spent the next few days reaching out to potential buyers, feeling the weight of each conversation she had. She didn't want to let go of the land, but as she spoke to different people, she realized that it wasn't about letting go. It was about saving what remained. If she could secure the right deal, they could rebuild the farm, get the resources they needed, and ensure that Hollow Creek could survive the winter. Finally, after days of negotiations and sleepless nights, she struck a deal. The terms weren't ideal, but they were the only way forward. She had sold part of the land, the area with the least viable crops for the season, but it was enough to secure the funds she needed to fix the farm and help the village. She didn't feel victorious. In fact, she felt like she had just handed over a piece of her soul. But as the snow began to fall lightly around her, she knew that the gamble she had taken was the only way to ensure survival for those she cared about. That evening, Martha stood on the porch, gazing out over the land. That had been her life. The storm was closing in, but for the first time in days she felt a glimmer of hope. The decision had been hard, but it was made. She had done what she thought was right. A sound interrupted her thoughts. Footsteps. She turned to see Tommy walking toward her, his expression serious. "Martha, there's something you need to see," he said, his voice tight. "The storm. It's worse than we thought." Martha's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Tommy's face was pale, his brow furrowed with concern. "The crops in the valley. There's a possibility that they might not survive the next wave. We have to get them out of the ground tonight, or it'll be too late." Martha's stomach churned. She had just made the hardest decision of her life, and now it seemed like the storm might strip it all away. The gamble she had taken could turn out to be a loss after all. She turned and faced the fields once more, the snow swirling around her like a warning. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "I'll make sure they get out." Under the dim light of the barn, Martha worked with Tommy, pushing herself beyond what she thought she could endure. They dug deep, pulling up the last of the crops, their breath visible in the freezing air. Every movement felt heavy, like a battle they couldn't afford to lose. By the time the storm hit, they had managed to save most of the harvest. The work wasn't over, but for now they had won a small victory. As they stood in the barn, exhausted and covered in dirt, Martha turned to Tommy. "We did it," she said quietly, a sense of relief washing over her. Tommy nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "It's not over yet, but we're closer." Martha looked at the harvested crops, their future uncertain but filled with possibility. This gamble, this risk, was their last hope. And in that moment, she realized that survival wasn't just about the land. It was about the people, the community, and the choices they made together. The morning after the storm, Martha woke to a world transformed. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a thick white blanket over everything. The sky, heavy with clouds, cast a dim light over the farm, but in the midst of the quiet, there was a sense of stillness and peace, a kind of calm before the real work began. Martha pulled on her coat and stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin. She took a deep breath, the sharpness of the morning filling her lungs. The storm had been brutal, but it had also provided something precious. Time. Time to gather the crops, time to hold on to the last threads of hope. As she made her way to the barn, she saw Tommy already at work, loading the harvested crops onto a cart. His back was hunched under the weight of the load, his breath visible in the air as he moved with purpose. "Morning, Tommy," Martha called out, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that still gripped her heart. Tommy looked up and gave her a nod, though his face was tired. "Morning, Martha. We've got a lot to do, but we're getting there. The crops we saved, they might be enough to see us through." Martha smiled, but there was a nervous edge to her. "Might be enough, but we need more than just what we've got, don't we?" Tommy hesitated for a moment before responding. "We've done the best we can, but you're right. We'll need every hand in the village to help with the rest. We can't carry it all alone." Martha nodded. She knew what needed to be done. They needed to make sure that the village knew about the crops they had saved. Word had to spread quickly, because there was no time to waste. The storm might have passed, but winter was far from over. If they didn't act fast, the food they had saved could spoil, and the community would be left with nothing. She turned to Tommy. "I'm going to the village. I'll talk to everyone and see if we can get people here to help with the rest. We can't afford to wait any longer." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "You sure? The storm's still fresh in people's minds." "Not everyone's going to believe it, I'm sure," Martha said firmly. "They'll believe it when they see the harvest. We just need to show them that there's still hope." The village was quiet as Martha made her way down the main street. The usual bustle was missing, replaced by a sense of heaviness that seemed to hang in the air. The people of Hollow Creek were resilient, but even the strongest hearts could only take so much. Martha knocked on the door of the first house she came to, and Sarah, a young woman with a toddler in her arms, opened it. Her face brightened when she saw Martha standing there, but the smile quickly faded. "Martha," Sarah said softly, "I heard about the storm. How's the farm?" Martha looked Sarah in the eye, her voice steady but with a sense of urgency. "The farm's still standing. We've saved what we could and there's more. I need your help." Sarah frowned, concern clouding her features. "What do you mean, help? We've barely got enough to feed our own families. The storm took so much." "I know," Martha said, her heart aching for Sarah and the other families in the village. "But we have crops we've harvested, not just for us but for everyone. It's not enough to go around without help, but if we all work together, we can get through this." There was a long pause as Sarah seemed to consider the words. Finally, she nodded, determination hardening in her eyes. "I'll help, we'll all help. We can't let our neighbors starve, we're in this together." Martha smiled, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll go to the others and get the word out. We'll start working right away." As she left Sarah's house and walked through the village, Martha felt the weight of her gamble. The people of Hollow Creek had always been there for each other, but this was different. This time, they had to do more than just survive. They had to rebuild. And Martha knew it wouldn't be easy. It never was. But she also knew something else, something she had learned from all her years of living on the land. The harder the storm, the stronger the resolve. And if they worked together, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. By noon, word had spread, and a small army of villagers had gathered at the farm ready to help. They came with shovels, carts, and buckets, determined to do whatever it took to preserve the harvest. With every person that joined the effort, the weight on Martha's shoulders seemed to lift a little more. As the day wore on, the work was grueling but rewarding. The crops, carefully gathered and stored, were now being processed and divided among the families in the village. There was a sense of camaraderie in the air. People worked side by side, no one asking for more than they could give, no one taking more than they needed. By sunset, Martha stood at the edge of the farm, watching as the last of the crops were loaded onto carts. The villagers had come through. The harvest they had fought so hard to save was now being shared, not just as food but as a symbol of their resilience. "Martha," Tommy said, coming to stand beside her, "you did it. We did it." Martha nodded, her eyes misty as she looked. Out over the field, the harvest now a promise for the future. "We did, but we'll have to keep going, Tommy. There's still more work to do." Tommy smiled, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We'll get there, one step at a time." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't just the crops they had saved. It was the spirit of the people, the strength they had shown in the face of adversity. And as she stood there, looking out over the fields, she knew one thing for sure: the gamble had been worth it. Hollow Creek wasn't just surviving. They were thriving. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Word of the harvest spread quickly through the village, and soon every family was benefiting from the crops Martha and the villagers had saved. The community came together in ways Martha had never imagined, each person contributing what they could. Some offered labor, others shared tools, and a few even brought their own supplies to contribute to the cause. But with every act of generosity, a quiet unease grew within Martha. She had sacrificed much to get this harvest, and now the village depended on her, and in some ways, on the farm. The burden of responsibility was heavier than she had anticipated. One morning, Martha found herself standing at the kitchen table, staring at a letter. It was from the local land authority, the very people who had initially mocked her for purchasing the failing farm at auction. The letter was official, curt, and filled with legal jargon, but its message was clear. The farm was still in a precarious position. The authorities were pushing for a decision on whether Martha would be able to fully sustain the farm and maintain the operation over the coming years. If the land didn't show a consistent profit, it might be seized or sold to someone else. Martha's hands trembled as she put the letter down. She had known the risk. She had known that saving the farm would be a long road filled with obstacles. But now, with the entire village depending on the success of the crops, The weight of her decision pressed down on her like a vice. "You all right, Martha?" Tommy's voice came from the doorway, breaking her thoughts. Martha sighed and glanced up at him. "I'm not sure. The village, the harvest, it's all been wonderful, Tommy. But the land itself, this farm, it's not out of the woods yet. We're still under the thumb of those people at the land authority. They've given me an ultimatum." Tommy stepped forward, his face hardening. "What do they want? Profit. They want to see if the farm can sustain itself. If it can't, they'll take it, just like they were going to before. They're already moving in that direction." Tommy's jaw clenched. "That's not fair. You've done everything right, Martha. You've saved the village, for heaven's sake. But they don't care about that. They care about money." Martha nodded, feeling the sting of the truth. "I know. But that's the reality. And if I can't prove the farm is going to stay profitable, they'll take it all away. And if they do, the village will be left with nothing." The silence in the room hung heavily between them, both of them knowing what this meant. It wasn't just about Martha anymore, it was about the future of Hollow Creek, and that future was now tied to the success of the farm. Tommy finally broke the silence. "What are you going to do?" Martha looked out the window, her mind racing with possibilities. "I don't know. I've fought this farm for so long. I've sacrificed everything I had to make it work. But if I don't prove it's profitable, soon it's all over." Tommy's eyes softened with understanding. "We'll help you, Martha. The village will help. We've all seen what you've done for us. It's time we return the favor." Martha turned to him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I can't ask you to do that. I've already asked so much." "You didn't ask. We all saw what you did for us. Now it's time to stand with you. Let us help you save the farm." For the next few weeks, the village rallied behind Martha in a way she had never expected. People who had once doubted her, or who had stayed on the sidelines, now stepped forward, offering their skills and labor without hesitation. The community came together, all working toward the common goal of proving that the farm could be profitable. Tommy organized the villagers, ensuring that the crops were properly cared for and that any extra labor was put to good use. They worked the fields long into the evenings, even as winter's chill crept in, determined to harvest every last crop that could sustain them. As the days passed, Martha found herself caught between the joy of seeing her neighbors come together and the anxiety of knowing that the land authority's ultimatum loomed ever closer. Every time she went to bed, she was haunted by the thought of losing it all. The farm, the village, the hope they had built together. One evening, after another long day of work, Martha sat on the porch, staring out at the farm. Tommy came and sat beside her, his face tired but content. They sat in silence for a moment before Tommy spoke up. "We're doing it, Martha. The farm looks better than it ever has. I think the land authority won't have much choice but to see what we've accomplished." Martha smiled weakly, though her heart still ached. "I hope you're right, Tommy. I really do. But there's something else I haven't told you." Tommy turned to her, his brow furrowing in concern. "What is it?" Martha hesitated before continuing. "Even if we can show them that the farm's profitable, there's one thing I can't promise. The farm is old, Tommy. The soil is worn out. Even with the work we've done, we might not have enough for the long term." Tommy looked at her, eyes wide with disbelief. "So what are we supposed to do? After all of this, we can't just let it go." "I don't know," Martha admitted softly. "But I'm not sure how much longer I can keep up the fight. I've given everything I have, and I don't know if it'll be enough." Tommy's hand gripped hers, his voice fierce with determination. "It's enough. You've given everything, and so have we. We're not letting this farm slip through our fingers, not after all we've been through. The village is behind you, Martha, and I'll fight for this farm too." Martha met his gaze, the weight of her fears still heavy on her shoulders, but for the first time in a long while she felt a spark of hope. The battle wasn't over, and maybe, just maybe, it never would be. The day had arrived. Martha stood in front of her modest farmhouse, the land that had once felt like an insurmountable challenge, now a symbol of resilience. Her fingers were clasped tightly together, and her breath came in short bursts. Tommy stood beside her, his face a mixture of pride and anticipation. The land authority representatives were due to arrive any minute, and the stakes had never been higher. Martha had spent countless hours preparing for this moment. The villagers had put their heart and soul into the farm's revival. It was now or never. As the sun began to set, the familiar sound of a vehicle approaching reached Martha's ears. A black sedan, sleek and official-looking, slowed as it neared the farm. The representatives had arrived. Martha's heart raced, and for a brief moment she felt the familiar wave of self-doubt wash over her. What if it wasn't enough? What if they didn't see the progress she'd fought so hard to make? Tommy squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You've done everything you can, Martha. Just let them see what we've done." Martha nodded, taking in a deep breath. She couldn't back down now, not after everything they had sacrificed. With one final glance at Tommy, she walked toward the gate to meet the visitors. The car came to a stop, and the first person to step out was a man in a sharp suit, his face stern and unreadable. Behind him, two others followed, their expressions neutral. The man in front was the land authority's representative, Mr. Turner, a man well known for his cold, business-like demeanor. "Martha Williams," Mr. Turner said with a slight nod, acknowledging her presence. "I trust everything is in order for us to assess the farm." Martha held her head high, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "Yes, I've been waiting for you." Mr. Turner didn't waste any time. "We're here to evaluate the farm's financial status. You're aware of the ultimatum. Prove this land can remain viable, or it will be sold." "I understand," Martha replied, her voice firm. "But I've already proven it. The harvest speaks for itself." With a brisk nod, Mr. Turner motioned for his colleagues to begin their inspection. As they walked toward the fields, Martha followed closely behind, her heart pounding in her ears. The farm had never looked better, but she knew that wasn't enough. They needed to see the results, not just the crops but the community it had saved, the way the village had come together to support the land. It was about so much more than just profit. As they moved through the rows of corn, wheat, and vegetables, Martha could see the skepticism in Mr. Turner's eyes. His eyes narrowed as he inspected the crops, pulling out handfuls of soil and inspecting them under the dimming light of the evening. "I must say," he said after a long pause, "I didn't expect much. You've done better than anticipated, but that doesn't mean you've proven your sustainability. How do you plan to ensure the farm remains profitable over the long term?" Martha took a deep breath. "I've been in this field long enough to know that the land needs care. We've put in the work, the soil has been revitalized, and we have a good rotation system in place. The village is involved now, and they've made sure the harvest doesn't go to waste. We've built a system, Mr. Turner, a real community-based system." She could feel Tommy's reassuring presence behind her, but she wasn't sure if it was enough to sway the man in front of her. The land authority wasn't interested in how hard the community had worked. It was always about numbers. Mr. Turner paused, looking at her with a calculating expression. "You've got a point, but you're still dealing with a farm that's nearly failed twice. What makes you think this time will be different?" Martha's response was immediate. "Because this time it's not just about me. It's about everyone here. The village's survival depends on it." Her words hung in the air between them, charged with emotion. Tommy stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "Martha's not just talking about crops. She's talking about the people. The village was on the brink of collapse, but now, thanks to her, we've all found a reason to fight, to live." For the first time that evening, Mr. Turner's expression softened. He didn't speak for a moment, simply watching. The villagers working in the fields. They were working together, tending the crops with care, ensuring that every plant had what it needed to thrive. Finally, Mr. Turner broke the silence. "I've seen enough." The three representatives exchanged glances. Martha held her breath, heart in her throat. "We'll return to our office and review everything," Mr. Turner said, his tone slightly less stern. "You'll have your answer soon." Martha and Tommy watched in silence as the representatives made their way back to the car, their expressions unreadable. She couldn't tell whether it was good or bad, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. The car drove away. Martha turned to Tommy, her voice low. "Do you think they'll let us keep it?" Tommy didn't immediately answer, but his gaze was steady. "I don't know, Martha. But I do know this. You've done everything you could, we all have. If they can't see that, then maybe we'll just have to keep fighting." Martha smiled weakly, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. That night, after the long day of waiting, Martha sat by the window, the familiar sound of the farm's night air filling the space. The village was quiet, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear. The farm had been saved, and so had the village. Whether the land authority would recognize that or not, Martha knew that the people of Hollow Creek had already found something much more valuable than money: hope. The next morning, Martha awoke before the sun, the familiar hum of the farm already stirring in the distance. The first rays of light painted the sky with streaks of gold, signaling the start of a new day. But for Martha, it was a day filled with anxiety. She hadn't slept much the night before, the uncertainty gnawing at her every thought. Tommy had stayed up late with her, talking about everything and nothing, trying to fill the silence with the comfort of his presence. They knew the decision from the land authority could come at any time, but the longer they waited, the heavier the weight of the unknown became. Would they be allowed to keep the farm? Would their hard work, the sacrifices of the village, be enough? As Martha made her way to the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. She was greeted by the steady rhythm of the villagers beginning their day. Many had returned to help with the harvest, determined to finish what they had started. The farm was no longer just Martha's responsibility. It had become the village's heartbeat. The door creaked open, and Tommy stepped inside, a fresh batch of letters in his hand. His face was unreadable as he approached her. "Martha," he said quietly, handing her the envelope. It was from the land authority. Her hands shook slightly as she took it. The envelope was official-looking, thick and sealed with a wax emblem. Martha swallowed hard, her pulse quickening as she peeled open the seal. Tommy stood beside her, his eyes fixed on her face, waiting for the verdict. Martha unfolded the letter slowly, her gaze moving across the carefully worded text. "Dear Mrs. Martha Williams, after a thorough review of your farm's progress and the efforts put forth by you and the Hollow Creek community, we have concluded that the farm shows significant improvement. While there are still challenges ahead, we believe that with continued effort, the farm can remain sustainable. We are pleased to inform you that the farm will remain under your ownership, and you will receive a grant to assist with further improvements. Congratulations." Martha's eyes scanned the letter once more, her mind processing the words. She blinked, the weight of what she had just read taking a moment to sink in. Slowly, a smile began to form on her lips, the tension of the past few weeks evaporating. "We did it," she whispered, more to herself than to Tommy. Tommy grinned, wrapping his arms around her. "You did it, Martha. You and everyone here, the village, that we all fought for this." Martha felt tears sting her eyes, but they were tears of relief, not sorrow. She had done it. Against all odds, she had saved the farm, saved the village, and brought them all back from the brink. For a moment, she just allowed herself to bask in the quiet triumph of it all. The door opened again, and several of the villagers entered the kitchen, their faces filled with curiosity. Seeing the letter in Martha's hands, they all stopped in their tracks. "What is it?" one of them, Sarah, asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Martha's smile widened as she looked at them, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's official," she said. "We've done it. The farm is ours to keep." A cheer erupted from the group. They gathered around her, embracing, laughing, and some even wiping away tears. The weight that had hung over them for so long was finally lifted. For Martha, this wasn't just a victory over the land authority. It was a victory over every obstacle that had stood in her way. Every lonely night, every setback, every doubt she had ever had. It was all worth it. The farm was theirs. And so was the future. Later that day, Martha stood in the middle of the field, watching the villagers work together to gather the harvest. The fields, once a symbol of failure and abandonment, now stood as a testament to the power of community, hope, and perseverance. The crops were abundant, more than enough to feed everyone in the village, and more. Tommy came up beside her, a quiet smile on his face. "You know, this might be the start of something bigger." Martha glanced at him, her gaze following the people working in the fields. "I think you're right. The farm is just the beginning. This community, we've shown what we can do when we come together. We can face anything now." Tommy nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "And I think people will start noticing. The village, this farm, people will want to be a part of it." Martha smiled, her heart filled with an indescribable warmth. "Then we'll make sure we're ready for them." The two of them stood there for a while, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. The farm wasn't just saved, it had become a symbol of what could happen when people refused to give up, no matter how bleak the situation seemed. As the evening settled in, Martha knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but for the first time in a long time she felt hopeful. The farm wasn't just a lifeline for the village, it was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no matter how hard life gets, there is always a way forward, as long as you have the strength to keep going. And Martha had that strength, more than she had ever realized. The sun had risen on a new chapter for Hollow Creek. The farm was no longer just a patch of land struggling to survive. It had become a symbol of hope, a beacon for the villagers who had risked everything to help Martha. The farm's revival had breathed new life into the entire community. But as the dust settled, new challenges began to surface. Martha stood at the edge of the field, her gaze sweeping across the rows of thriving crops. The wheat was golden, the corn tall and strong, and the vegetables were vibrant. It was a sight she had once thought impossible, but now it was a reality. The harvest, which had seemed so uncertain just a few months ago, was overflowing. The village no longer had to worry about starvation. With the grant from the land authority, the farm was on its way to long-term sustainability. But there was something Martha knew they hadn't prepared for: growth. The village was thriving, but it was also expanding, and that brought its own set of problems. "We've got a problem," Tommy's voice interrupted her thoughts. Martha turned to find him walking toward her, his expression serious. "What is it?" "It's the roads," he said, gesturing toward the dirt path that led from the village to the farm. "The more people come to help, the more difficult it's becoming to move around. The tractors are getting stuck. We need better access if we want to keep up with this pace." Martha frowned, looking down at the dirt path. It had always been enough for the few villagers who had worked the land in the past. But now it wasn't going to cut it. The village was growing and the farm needed better infrastructure to support its newfound success. "We can't afford much right now," Martha said, biting her lip. "The grant we received isn't for things like this." Tommy nodded. "I know, but it's something we'll have to address sooner rather than later. If we don't fix it, the farm's success will be limited." Martha sighed, looking around at the land. Everything they had worked so hard for was teetering on the edge of a new challenge. It wasn't just about the crops anymore, it was about making sure that the farm could continue to grow and support the village in the long term. The community had come together, but that didn't mean the challenges were over. "I'll talk to the village council," Martha said finally, determination in her voice. "We'll figure something out." The village council gathered that evening, a mix of men and women of all ages sitting around a large wooden table. It was a familiar sight for Martha now, the same faces that had helped her restore the farm. There was Sarah, the schoolteacher, always practical but kind. Then there was Mark, the blacksmith, who had spent countless hours repairing tools and machinery. And of course Tommy, who had become her closest ally throughout this journey. Martha stood at the head of the table, her hands clasped in front of her. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze on her. They were counting on her to lead them through this next phase. "The farm is thriving," she began, looking around at the group. "We've done it. But we're at a point where the infrastructure is starting to fall behind. The roads are too narrow and rough. It's getting difficult to move everything around, and the pace of the harvest is only going to increase. We need to fix this." There was a murmur of agreement around the table. Mark was the first to speak. "I've been thinking about that too," he said, his gruff voice carrying across the room. "The road's fine for now, but once we get the new crops in, we'll need better transport. And if we're bringing in more people to help, it's going to get crowded quick." "I agree," Sarah added. "But what are our options? We can't afford to bring in heavy machinery or hire outside help. We've already stretched our budget thin with the grant, Martha nodded. I know, but we can't afford to wait until it becomes a bigger problem. If we don't act now, it'll only cost us more in the long run. The room fell into a heavy silence as everyone considered the situation. Finally, Tommy spoke up. What if we work together to build the road? Ourselves, he suggested. We've already proven that when we come together we can make things happen. Maybe we can find a way to build something with the resources we have. Martha's eyes widened as she thought about the possibility. You think we could? I know we could, Tommy said with confidence. We've got the skills here, Mark. You know how to work with metal. Sarah, you've got connections. And we've got enough hands to get the job done. We can do this. Martha stood in thought for a moment, her mind turning over the idea. It would take a lot of effort, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. If they pooled their resources, if they worked together, they could build the road themselves. It wasn't just about the farm. It was about the future of the village as a whole. All right, she said finally, her voice resolute. Let's do it. We'll build the road together. The room erupted into applause, the sound of hope and determination filling the space. The task ahead of them was daunting, but it was also a challenge they were ready to face. As the meeting adjourned, Martha couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This wasn't just about a farm anymore. It was about building a future, a community that supported each other through every challenge. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time Martha felt ready to take it on. The next few weeks were filled with hard work. The villagers, fueled by a sense of purpose, set to work on the road. Mark led the effort, organizing the men to clear the way and lay down the foundation. Sarah worked with the local suppliers, finding the best materials they could afford. And Tommy, always by Martha's side, helped organize the labor, making sure everyone knew what needed to be done. Martha spent her days overseeing the progress, making sure everyone had what they needed, and offering a steady hand when the work seemed too much. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the weight of the task threatened to overwhelm them, but with each passing day, the road began to take shape, and with it, the future of Hollow Creek. The sun had barely touched the horizon when Martha stood at the newly completed road, her hand resting lightly on the wooden fence that bordered the farm. The road, which had once been nothing more than a rough, dusty path, now stretched wide and sturdy, winding its way through the fields toward the village. The gravel was smooth, the edges reinforced, and the space between the fields and homes felt expansive, as if opening up new possibilities. The sound of work had quieted down for the day, and Martha stood there in the stillness, reflecting on how far they had come. The farm, once a broken place of struggle, was now alive with hope. The village, once on the brink of despair, had found strength in its unity. And the road represented more than just infrastructure. It was a lifeline, a bridge between the farm and the village, between the past and the future. Tommy walked up beside her, his boots crunching on the newly laid gravel. He stood quietly for a moment, gazing at the road as well. He had been there every step of the way, helping her rebuild, organizing the labor, and supporting her vision. He knew how important this moment was. We did it, he said softly. Martha smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. We did. But it's not just me, Tommy, it's all of us, every single person in this village. Tommy nodded. That's true, but you led us. Without you, none of this would have happened. Martha's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet resolve. I didn't do it alone, and it's not just about saving the farm anymore. It's about the future of this village, this road, this farm. It's the foundation of something bigger. They both stood in silence for a while, watching as the sun slowly climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. The warmth of the morning light seemed to promise that the hard work was over, but Martha knew that the true challenge was just beginning. It was one thing to save the farm, but now they had to ensure that it could continue to thrive, and the village, Hollow Creek, needed to grow, evolve, and find new ways to support itself and its people. They had created something beautiful, but they had to protect it, nurture it, and allow it to flourish. The road wasn't just a connection to the outside world, it was a symbol of the village's future. As they walked back to the house, they could see the first of the harvest coming in. The fields were abundant, more than they had ever imagined. The villagers had worked tirelessly to make this happen, but there was still work to be done. The crops had to be processed, stored, and distributed. The future of the farm relied on their ability to make the most of what they had. "I think we should start thinking about what comes next," Tommy said as they reached the porch. "What can we do to make sure the farm continues to grow, that it becomes even more self-sustaining? And what about the village? We've built a foundation, but we can't stop now." Martha sighed, settling into her chair as she thought about his words. The future was a big, uncertain question, and for the first time she felt the weight of it. They had done so much, and yet she knew that it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. "We'll need to expand," she said thoughtfully. "We've got the infrastructure now. The road will help with access to the farm, and it will make it easier for us to get what we need to grow. But we also need more resources, more manpower, new methods of farming. If we want this to work, long-term we need to think bigger." Tommy leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "I agree. And what if we could bring in people from outside the village, offer them a chance to work with us, teach them our methods, and help them start their own farms?" Martha paused, considering the idea. "That could work. We could turn Hollow Creek into something more than just a village. We could make it a model, show other communities how a place can come together, rebuild and thrive. It's not just about farming. It's about creating a community of people who care about each other and the land." Tommy grinned. "That sounds like a vision worth fighting for." Martha smiled, her heart filled with a sense of purpose. "Then let's fight for it." They spent the rest of the day discussing plans for the future, how to bring in new people, how to ensure the farm remained viable, and how they could continue to grow the village in a sustainable way. It was a big task, and there was still so much work to be done. But for the first time in a long while, Martha felt like they were truly on the right path. As the evening set in, the village came together. Again, the harvest was underway. The streets were filled with laughter, and there was a sense of togetherness in the air that hadn't been there before. The people of Hollow Creek weren't just surviving, they were thriving. And Martha knew that. This was only the beginning. In the months that followed, the farm continued to prosper. The new road allowed for easier transportation, and the village began to expand. More people came to Hollow Creek, drawn by the story of a place that had risen from the brink of collapse. Martha, with the help of her community, led the charge in teaching new farmers, sharing their knowledge and experiences with others. They brought in new technology, new crops, and new ways of thinking about sustainability. The village became a hub of innovation, a model for other rural communities across the region. But through it all, the core values of Hollow Creek remained unchanged: the belief in hard work, in community, and in never giving up. And as Martha stood at the edge of the farm once again, looking out at the fields that had become her life, she knew that the future was bright. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was theirs to travel together. The promise of tomorrow was no longer just a dream, it was a reality.